Hey guys, now that we are just 63 days away from the midterms in November, I'll be updating you guys on my new prediction for this year's governor elections. These races are going to be vital in determining many of the new laws that will be passed in each of the individual states for the next 4 years. And so this year we have governor elections in most of the states. Other states do hold their governor elections in off years. However, in the midterm year, we do have most of these gubernatorial elections. And so I've already filled in many of the solid Democratic and Republican states. These governors or the candidates in these races are going to win whichever respective party they're in. They're going to win their races. So there's really no point in talking about any of these solid states. Democrats are going to hold on to their governorships in California, Illinois, and New York, and then flip the governorships in Maryland and Massachusetts, where Republicans are going to basically win and hold on to all these governorships that they currently control. Now, we do have 17 toss-up races, but many of them are going to be likely Democratic or Republican states, so they really won't be all that competitive either. And so I'm going to start off by filling in the likely states on this map as well, just so we can spend more time focusing on the lean and tilt states. And so there are a few obvious likely states on this map just right off the bat. These are going to be states in which either party is going to win by around margins of 5 to 15%. So one party does have the clear edge in these races, but there are still going to be states in which either party will pump money into. So starting off with the two obvious likely Democratic states, we have Connecticut and Rhode Island. Ned Lamont in Connecticut and Dan McKee in Rhode Island are both running for their re-elections to a second term. While for the Republicans, obviously Alaska is going to stay red, with Mike Dunleavy running for a second term. Yes, the Republicans did lose the House special election with Sarah Palin losing to Mary Peltola, but Mike Dunleavy is not Sarah Palin. He's not nearly as unpopular as the former governor. Now, looking at some of these other likely races, I do want to take a look at the data that we have in these states, because some of these races really are very high-profile races either way. In Texas, we of course have the election between Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke. Abbott currently leads in the polls by a margin of 8.9%, so really a very significant margin. Beto O'Rourke may have almost beat Ted Cruz in 2018 for a Senate seat, but he is not going to become the next governor of Texas. Greg Abbott is going to win his third term in office. That is almost guaranteed. He's led in every single poll that's been released, so obviously Texas is going to be a likely Republican state. We also have a relatively competitive election in Florida. However, considering how purple Florida used to be, this race is pretty lopsided for the GOP incumbent, that of course being Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is the frontrunner for the 2024 GOP nomination for president, and if he wants to become the nominee in 2 years, he is going to have to win his re-election right now. Currently, Ron DeSantis leads by a margin of 7.1% against Charlie Crist. Crist is the former governor serving from 2007 until 2011, and then he lost a major Senate election against Marco Rubio, and then another governor election as a Democrat against Rick Scott. Previously, Charlie Crist was a Republican when he was the governor of Florida. So Charlie Crist won the Democratic nomination pretty resoundingly against Nikki Fried, and he will, of course, be the one to eventually challenge DeSantis this November. But Ron DeSantis is in a good position. Even the most Democratic pollsters have DeSantis leading. I do think he will win by a margin over 5%. His election in 2018 really was very competitive. He only won by 0.39% against Andrew Gillum. This was the closest election for any governor race in the 2018 cycle, but in 2022, Florida is going to be likely Republican. We also have the state of Colorado. This is going to go to the Democrats with Jared Polis running for his re-election. I did have Colorado as a solid Democratic state before, but new numbers are showing that Colorado may be just a bit more competitive. Joe Biden won the state in the 2020 presidential election by a margin of 13.5%. I do not think Jared Polis will do any better than the former president or than the current president at this point. Of course, in 2018, Polis did win by double digits, but of course 2018 was a much more favorable year for Democrats than 2022 is right now. So Colorado, I do only have it as being likely Democratic. The two most recent polls, even though they are Republican funded, they do show Jared Polis leading by margins less than 10%. So Colorado is going to be a likely Democratic state. We also have the state of Georgia, where Brian Kemp is running for a second term in office against Stacey Abrams. Kemp only narrowly defeated the Democratic nominee in 2018. Abrams is now running for a second time, but 4 years ago, Brian Kemp only won by 1.4%. This was one of the closest elections of the year, and of course before this, Georgia had voted for Republicans in every single presidential election going back over 20 years. Joe Biden did end that streak in 2020, but Georgia still has a very long Republican voting history, and the 2018 race was a lot closer than expected. But in 2022, Brian Kemp, as incumbent governor, he is a popular governor overall and is in a very good position to win his second full term in office. So Georgia is going to be a likely Republican state, and the final likely state we have on this map is going to be the state of Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer is running for her second term here. In 2018, she won her first term by 9.6% against Bill Schuette, and I do not think she's going to win by as large of a margin against Tudor Dixon, simply because Democrats are not in as good of a position as they were in 2018. Remember, in 2018, Donald Trump was still the president. He was at that point the most unpopular president at that point in the presidency going to the midterms. So Gretchen Whitmer in 2018 was in a much better position considering the national environment than she is right now. But I do think she's going to win her re-election. I think she will win by over 5%, even though the poll numbers are going for Tudor Dixon. But I mean, if you just look at what the numbers were a couple of months ago, she was at 22.5%. So that really is not too good of a starting point. That's why her numbers have gone up so significantly. If you just look at the graph alone, Gretchen Whitmer is going to win her re-election. So Michigan is going to be the final likely state on this map. And so now we have the lean and tilt states left. Lean states are states that are going to vote for either party by margins of around 1 to 5%, and tilt states are states that I project margins of less than 1% for either party. So I'm going to start off with the three remaining major races that we have in the Midwest. These, of course, are the races in the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Democrats control all three of these governorships currently. Tim Walz and Tony Evers are running for their re-elections in Minnesota and Wisconsin, while Tom Wolf won his re-election in 2018 by a solid margin, but is ineligible to run for a third term this November. So starting off with the election in Minnesota, Democrats currently are leading in the polls right now. Tim Walz led by 4 and 2% in the two latest polls against Scott Jensen. Scott Jensen is a Republican, a former member of the Minnesota State Senate, and he has really been very pro-Trump in the last couple of months as he was vying for the GOP support. However, as of right now, Scott Jensen is not expected to win this race. 538 only gives Jensen a 9% chance at flipping Minnesota. I think that Tim Walz is going to win by a margin less than 5%. You cannot overestimate Democrats in the Midwest. They almost always do worse than expected. Joe Biden definitely did that in 2020. So Minnesota right now, I do have as a lean Democratic state. Yes, Democrats did do very well in 2018 in the Midwest. Minnesota, double-digit margin. Michigan at almost double digits. Pennsylvania, 17% margin for Tom Wolf. And of course, Wisconsin was a flip with Tony Evers becoming the new governor of the state. But in 2022, Joe Biden is the president. He is still a very unpopular president, even though his numbers are going up. You cannot overestimate the fact that Democrats are not going to do as well as they did 4 years ago. Next up in Wisconsin, Tony Evers leads by just 1% against Tim Michels. Tim Michels won the Republican nomination against Rebecca Kleefisch. He did get the support of Donald Trump, but Tim Michels is much less a pro-Trump candidate than many of the other gubernatorial nominees. He really is much more moderate, and that is why Tony Evers is in such a precarious situation. Tony Evers is probably one of the most vulnerable Democrats running for re-election. Of course, I think that Laura Kelly is going to be the most vulnerable, and she is running for re-election in Kansas, but Wisconsin is going to be a very, very competitive state this November. Wisconsin is a fully purple state now. Democrats do not have the edge in the state that they once did, and so right now with Tony Evers only leading by 1%, this race very much could go both ways. I think the only good news right now for the Democratic governor is that the latest Trafalgar poll shows him ahead of Michels by a margin of 1%. This really is a pretty big deal. So as of right now, I'm going to categorize Wisconsin as a tilt state, but I am going to give it to the Republicans. The last time that a Democratic governor won a Wisconsin governor's election with a Democratic president in the White House was all the way back in 1962 when JFK was still the president. So I think that Tony Evers is going to face a very tough re-election, and as of right now, I think Republicans do have a very slight edge in the state. Wisconsin is a state that is trending to the right, unlike many of the states in the Sun Belt like Arizona or Georgia. Wisconsin is not moving anywhere near the left, and so that is why I have Tony Evers right now losing his re-election by a very narrow margin. And finally, in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro is probably going to succeed Tom Wolf. I don't think that is too surprising at all. Doug Mastriano is by far the worst Republican gubernatorial candidate. He simply is too extreme of a Republican, and so Josh Shapiro right now leads by 7.3% in the polls, very similar to the margin we're seeing for John Fetterman over Mehmet Oz. And with neither Mastriano or Oz being good candidates, they're not going to help each other when voters vote in Pennsylvania. You're not going to see too much split ticketing. I think they're both equally bad candidates, that the Democratic nominees in both of the Senate and governor races are going to pick up support from most independent and, of course, Democratic voters, and that will be enough for them to win the races. I do not think that Pennsylvania is going to be likely Democratic. Joe Biden only won the state by 1.2% in 2020, so as of right now, Pennsylvania only as a lean state for the Democratic Party. I do think, though, that Josh Shapiro has a very good chance. 530 agrees with me as well. They currently give Shapiro an 85% chance at defeating Mastriano. Trump did have a rally recently helping both Mastriano and Dr. Oz, but that really is not going to do too much. Donald Trump is more unpopular than he's ever been, going back all the way to the insurrection 2 years ago. So Trump is at a low point as well, just like the Republican nominees right now in Pennsylvania. Now, moving on to the state of Maine, we have the election between Janet Mills and Paul LePage. Paul LePage is the former two-term governor from 2011 to 2019. He was the predecessor to Janet Mills, but is now running for a third non-consecutive term. Janet Mills has led in the two recent polls, but those were from a couple of months ago. Paul LePage officially won the Republican nomination this summer, and I think that he is a good candidate overall. He is somebody that can win this race, but considering that Maine is still much more of a Democratic state than a Republican one, Janet Mills is probably going to win her re-election to a second term. Running a former governor really is not that bad of an idea. Janet Mills is going to face a pretty competitive election no matter what, but right now, Paul LePage is not in that good of a position. 538 only gives him a 17% chance at winning this race. Maine, according to 538, is actually a likely Democratic state, but I do think it is going to be closer than what 538 says. I do think Janet Mills is going to win by a margin under 5%, but still a win nonetheless to a second term for the Democratic incumbent. Next up, in Oregon, I think we have one of the most interesting races here. We have a three-way race, actually. This is the only major three-way race that we have this year between Tina Kotek, Christine Drazan, and Betsy Johnson. Johnson is a former Democrat that is running as an independent in this election. Democrats are not that popular on the gubernatorial level in Oregon. Kate Brown is the current governor. She was reelected in 2018, only by a margin of 6.4%. And Bueller was really not even that great of a candidate. Kate Brown was just very unpopular, and that's why Tina Kotek is doing so poorly. Tina Kotek is a very establishment Democrat as well, just like Brown, and so Democrats are going to struggle in the state. I mean, just look at the Michigan election. Whitmer won by 9.6% in a state that Trump won in 2016. Oregon was almost a solid state for Hillary Clinton in that election, and Kate Brown only won by 6.4% 2 years later in a midterm where Trump was the very unpopular president in the White House. And so in Oregon, I think that even though the polls do show Christine Drazan and Betsy Johnson both in a pretty good position, they're not going to end up winning the race. I think Betsy Johnson obviously is going to split the vote with Tina Kotek, but independents almost always do worse than expected. So Tina Kotek, I think that she is going to win the race. I'm very confident in the fact that she will become the next Democratic governor for Oregon, but the margin I think is only going to be under 5%, even though it will be almost a guaranteed win. Democrats are not going to lose in the state of Oregon, and even if Betsy Johnson wins, you're going to have a liberal governor in the governor's mansion. In Nevada and Arizona, we're going to have two of the most competitive races of the year. I think the other two close elections are going to be Wisconsin and Kansas. But in Nevada, Steve Sisolak is running for a second term. He won his first one in 2018 by 4% against Adam Laxalt. And yes, Democrats have been winning in recent elections in Nevada. They won the Senate election in 2016 with the election of Catherine Cortez Masto to succeed Harry Reid. And then they won it in the presidential election in 2020. And then, of course, Sisolak was elected the governor in 2018. And we also had Jackie Rosen defeat Dean Heller in 2018 for the other Senate seat as well, but those are all by pretty small margins. Democrats have really not won by anything over 10% since 2008 in a major race, and right now Nevada is a state that is heavily shifting to the right. The state is becoming more and more purple by the day, as Hispanic voters are not as reliable for Democratic candidates as they once were. Sisolak has led in most polls in the summer. However, the most recent Chicago Group poll does find that Lombardo is up by 3%. I don't think this is too much to worry about for the Sisolak campaign, but they are in a very competitive state, and right now I do have Nevada only as a tilt state in favor of the Democratic Party. Next up in Arizona, Katie Hobbs is running for governor against Carrie Lake in the governor election in Arizona. Arizona is going to be one of those other very competitive races simply because Arizona is so purple of a state. Hobbs currently leads by a margin of 1.9% against Lake, and if you look at the overall spread here, Katie Hobbs did lead in many of the polls going into the Republican primary, but after Carrie Lake won the nomination against Karen Taylor Robeson, her numbers have actually increased just slightly. The most recent Fargo poll does show her up by 1%, but really a 1% margin for a Republican in a poll conducted by the Fargo group means absolutely nothing. I do think Katie Hobbs has a very slight advantage in this race. Carrie Lake barely won the GP primary. I mean, it was a pretty disappointing margin for a campaign. Karen Taylor Robeson received the endorsement of both Doug Ducey, the current governor of Arizona, and of course former Vice President Mike Pence, while Carrie Lake was backed by MAGA Republicans and of course former President Trump. So of course Trump did come out on top in that battle, but Carrie Lake only won by around 10%, and I do not think she is going to become the next governor of Arizona. She does have a very good chance, but I do think it is going to be a tilt race in favor of Democrats right now in the Arizona governor election. And if you look at the 538 forecast, Democrats currently have a 63% chance at winning in Nevada and a 53% chance at winning in Arizona. So both of these races are going to be highly competitive, but I agree with 538. Democrats do have a very small edge. And the final two states we have left are New Mexico and Kansas. In New Mexico, we have probably one of the worst Democratic incumbents this November. This is going to be Michelle Lujan Grisham. She won by 14% in 2018, but she has quickly become one of the most unpopular governors in the country. She has sexual assault allegations against her, and if you look at the most recent polls, the most recent Ranchetti internal poll actually shows him leading by 1%. And in a state that Joe Biden won by 10% in 2020, these numbers really are not good for Democrats. If you look at many of the other recent polls, Lujan Grisham is slightly ahead. I do not think she's going to win by over 7 points. I think around a 5% margin is going to be pretty accurate, but I am only going to give New Mexico a lean categorization. I think that even though there's a chance she wins by over 5%, I don't think New Mexico is as blue of a state on the gubernatorial level this year as is other states like Colorado, Rhode Island, or Connecticut. And finally, the last state we have left is Kansas. I saved this race for last. I think Kansas is going to be the most interesting election that we have. This is, of course, the state that Laura Kelly is running for re-election in as the incumbent Democratic governor. She was elected by a 5-point margin in 2018, a surprisingly large one considering how red of a state Kansas has been. It's only voted for Democrats, I believe, around 3 times in presidential elections since the 1930s, and Laura Kelly ran against a very poor Republican in 2018, that being Chris Kobach. This time around, Derek Schmidt is much more moderate of a candidate. He's the current Attorney General of Kansas and has led in the 2 most recent polls. These polls, though, are Republican internals, but I think that even though abortion issues are a major thing in Kansas right now after that abortion referendum failed, Laura Kelly is still probably not going to gain enough votes to win her a second term. I think that it will be very close, but I do have Kansas currently as a leading Republican state. I think it's going to be a 2 to 3 point margin. Even though Laura Kelly is doing a good job as governor, at least that's what her approval says, Republicans are still probably going to come out a lot more. Kansas is still a very red state. You have to remember that Trump won it by over 15% in both 2016 and 2020. 2016, I think, is actually, or 2020, I think the margin was just right under 15%, but I mean, still a very solid Republican state. Democrats are probably not going to hold onto the governorship in Kansas, no matter how popular Laura Kelly is. And so this is my updated prediction for the 2022 gubernatorial elections. Democrats winning 23 governorships, 27 for the GOP. Democrats flipping Massachusetts, Maryland, and Arizona. Republicans flipping Kansas and Wisconsin. Even though the latter 3 races, I think, can still be very, very close. They really could still very much go both ways. And so this is the current governor's map. 22 governorships for the Democrats, 28 for the Republicans after they picked up Virginia in 2021. Yes, Democrats do have governors in both Kentucky and Louisiana. John Bel Edwards in Louisiana and Andy Beshear in Kentucky. That's why I think these governor elections are so interesting to look at. I mean, we also have a Democrat, of course, in Kansas running for their re-election this November. And so if my prediction were to come true, Democrats would win, of course, 23 governorships. It would be a net gain of 1 governorship for the Democratic Party. Even though they win less governorships, they're still probably going to govern more people. As you can see here, it's not just the sheer amount of states that each party wins, it's the amount of people that they will be able to have an impact on. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think is going to win more governorships after these midterms. Do you think Democrats can pull off wins in Kansas and Wisconsin, or do you think Republicans will be able to hold on to the state of Arizona? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Consider purchasing a channel membership for just 99 cents per month to gain extra perks on this channel as we head into the midterms, and consider joining my Discord server as well. Link at the very top of the description below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.